History shows that more often than not, success in combat goes to the better trained, the highly motivated, and the more resourceful, qualities exemplified by the United States Marine Corps. Marines exist for the assault and capture of enemy territory. Marine air paves the way, operating from land or sea, whether in fast attack fighters or helicopter support missions. Flying for the Marine in the air is only a means to a singular end, to support the Marine on the ground. The sounds of war have echoed through the valleys of California's Mojave Desert since World War II, when George Patton trained fledgling U.S. armored divisions. Here, far from the encroachments of civilization, the U.S. Marine Corps has established its Air-Ground Combat Center.
Range 3360!
Range 3360! Fire!
In an area the size of Rhode Island, Marines refine tactics and flex the muscles of their basic combat organization, the Marine Air-Ground Task Force. As a supporting arm for the task force commander, Marine Corps Aviation has many functions: transport, reconnaissance, interdiction. Inevitably, it comes down to direct support of the rifleman on the ground. It's called CAS, Close Air Support, and the Marines have refined it to an operational art. Today on OP X-Ray, school is in session. These are seasoned Marine Corps aviators, temporarily earthbound for tour of duty as ground forward air controllers in what the Marines call the TACP, Tactical Air Control Party. They will be the point elements of the air-ground team, calling in airstrikes and using a variety of means to mark targets.
There they go. Oh, beauty.
Yeah.
We're out here for 3 days doing a fire exercise so that our forward air control students can get some hands-on time with the radios, hands-on with the various pieces of equipment that we train them to use, and get used to talking to airplanes and seeing how all of this comes together in one package.
Since we are pilots, we know how they do it, they know how we do it. They show up to a contact point that we assign them, and then they say, "Hi, this is us, we're here." Our job is to coordinate and deconflict. Most importantly, we get marks out on the ground, and then when the airplane shows up, we give him that final direction to the target, to talk his eyes onto the target. Once he visually acquires it, then he can drop on it.
So if there's a ground unit on the ground, that's Marine Air responsibility, and that's the way we take our job. You know, it's serious for us. If we get Marines on the ground, we want to be there for them. We want to see them get the support that they need.
Marine Corps Aviation originated with the growth of the Steel Navy. The range of the battleships provided a new mission for the Marines: the occupation and defense of advanced bases for the fleet. The airplane was thought to be possibly useful in this pursuit. The first Marine to venture skyward was Lieutenant Alfred Cunningham, who soloed in August of 1912 after 2 hours and 40 minutes of instruction. He was officially designated Naval Aviator Number 5. As early as 1914, the Marine Corps had demonstrated the utility of airplanes to ground operations, but it wasn't until 4 years later that marine aviation would establish its own identity. During America's brief but bloody involvement in World War I, Marines flew over 50 bombing missions in support of Allied ground forces, confirmed 4 aerial kills, and received 2 Medals of Honor. More significantly, Marines had proven their ability to put an effective air force in the field. During the 2 decades between world wars, the only aviators to see combat were Marines, deployed with expeditionary brigades in the Caribbean and Central America. Beginning in 1927, operations in Nicaragua against the Sandino rebels amounted to a veritable close air support proving ground. In the first direct aerial support mission in Marine Corps history, planes flew 125 miles to dive bomb and strafe a Sandino force overrunning an outpost at 𝑣𝒂𝒑𝒐𝒏𝒔. The rebels sustained heavy casualties and withdrew in disarray.
The Banana Wars, Haiti, Santo Domingo, Nicaragua, gave the Marines a chance to experiment. That was the only aviation that was firing in anger during that interwar World War I to World War II period. And there was a lot of experimentation and evacuation. Medevacs, air supply, airdrops, bombing close to friendly positions that were marked by panels. You know, little by little, doctrine begins to be put down on paper, and people teach it in our schools. They read it, they follow it, they improve on it, and it's an evolutionary process. The roots go back there, no question about it.
In 1928, a new aircraft arrived in Nicaragua to replace the battered DH-4s the Marines had flown since the end of World War I. The O-2U was the first in a line of Vought Company attack planes to carry the name Corsair. Over a period of 3 days, a Marine pilot flying a Corsair delivered 1,400 pounds of supplies to a cut-off patrol, and under constant enemy fire, brought out 18 severely wounded Marines. Lieutenant Christian Schuldt was given sincere thanks by the Marines and a Medal of Honor from President Calvin Coolidge. As the Great Depression gripped the jugular of the industrial world, the Marines returned home to an uncertain future. Redemption was found in the establishment of the Navy's Fleet Marine Force. It confirmed the Marines' unique amphibious assault mission and further defined the air wing's supporting role to ground troops. Throughout the decade of the 1930s, the Navy and Marine Corps refined amphibious doctrine. As a functional part of naval aviation, Marines trained aboard carriers for the first time. At air shows across the country, Navy and Marine pilots displayed their precision flying skills. Dive bombing, perfected by the Marines in Nicaragua, was a favorite of the crowds. The Germans took keen interest in these displays, eventually designing their own diving battle planes, Stukas. War again came to Marine Corps aviation on December 7, 1941, when Japanese Zeros destroyed 47 of 48 planes based at Iwa, 10 miles from Pearl Harbor. The Japanese rolled across the Pacific in a 3,000-mile offensive without parallel in military history. From Wake Island, the radio message, "Enemy on island, issue in doubt," summarized the bleakness of the American military situation. When their last plane went down, the Marine pilots on Wake fought as infantry. They were holding out for a rescue force that never came. During the battle to defend Midway in June 1942, Marine Corps land-based aircraft were the first to engage the powerful Japanese carrier force. Flying obsolete SB-2 Vindicators and F-2 Buffaloes, the Marines went head-on with seasoned Japanese Navy pilots. In deflecting the initial impact, the Marines were cut to pieces. The Buffalo had been the Navy's first production monoplane. Against the agile Zero, it was virtually helpless.
The worst plane I've ever flown. There's a little ball that shows you when your wings are level, or when you're not skidding. It's called a needle and ball. And it's supposed to be right in the middle. No matter what kind of maneuver you're doing, it's supposed to be there. You're not supposed to skid. Well, in the Brewster Buffalo, the only time I ever saw the ball in the middle was when it was passing from one side to the other. I didn't like it. That was a very poor excuse for a fighter plane.
The Japanese advance was halted at Midway by the slenderest of margins. The Marine pilots had exhibited extraordinary heroism at great cost. The infamous Buffalo was put out to pasture. The landings at Guadalcanal and Tulagi in August 1942 put the Allies on the offensive for the first time. It marked the beginning of a brutal 18-month push through the Solomons. The island-hopping campaign would become synonymous with Marine Corps aviation. In the skies over Guadalcanal, it was the Marines who would counter the Japanese bomber threat. The tool was the Grumman Wildcat.
It was one of the most fun planes I've ever flown. The first time I flew it, I thought, well, I'll do a snap roll. So I thought, well, maybe 120 knots would be all right. So I jammed the stick back, and before I could even get it around to make a little figure J, the plane had gone around 4 or 5 times without any control at all from me. I didn't do snap rolls anymore. Grumman builds a rugged airplane, and it can take a lot of enemy fire without getting knocked down. Our self-sealing tanks and our armor plate really helped them a lot.
The Americans had expanded the unfinished Japanese airstrip using captured equipment. It was named Henderson Field in honor of the major who led the Marine dive bombers at Midway. It was from this dust-choked slab under constant attack the so-called Cactus Air Force claimed its first victories.
The tactics of making one pass, and if you didn't get them on that pass, try to get out of the fight. The dogfights were won by exceptional pilots like Joe Foss and Walsh. Those people were unusual people. They could probably beat anybody in anything. But the run-of-the-mill fighter pilot had to depend on knowing his machinery and knowing the enemy machinery and taking advantage of those differences.
The legend of the Zero, and by extension, Japanese invincibility, was put to rest by the F-4F and Marines on Guadalcanal. In February 1943, the airplane most closely associated with the Marines in World War II arrived in the Solomons. The Vought F-4U was the second plane to carry the name Corsair. To the Marines, it was the bent-wing bird. Designed in 1938 and flown in 1940, the Corsair was essentially designed around its Pratt & Whitney 2,000 horsepower radial engine. It was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour and was ideally suited to both offensive and defensive roles. The Corsair's 13-foot propeller made a distinctive whine. The Japanese called it whistling death.
I have great admiration for that airplane. It had a lot of growth in it. You find out it can do several things. And the Corsair went through several evolutions. The Wildcat was a pretty good fighter, and our guys did a magnificent job. But the Corsair opened up a whole new world for them. Had greater ability to get to altitude, to seek altitude advantage, had longer legs, and was a very powerful airplane in a dogfight. And was the first bird out there to become a real match for the Zero.
By mid-1943, all the Marine fighter squadrons in the South Pacific were flying the F-4U. As the Allies pushed north toward Rabaul, the Corsairs would fly out of crushed coral airstrips with names like Sedji, Munda, Vela La Vela, Piva South, and Piva North, one step behind the advancing ground troops. The havoc wrought by the Marines in their Corsairs had far-reaching impact. In a single June day in 1944, pilots of the U.S. Navy succeeded in shooting down 383 largely inexperienced Japanese in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The cream of Japanese naval aviation had long been dead, killed by Marines over the Solomons. Marine Corps Aviation was unable to concentrate exclusively on supporting its own ground forces during the first years of the war. Air superiority was a priority. Nevertheless, considerable progress in close air support tactics had been achieved. In the battle for 𝑣𝒊𝒔𝒂𝒑𝒐𝒏🔔 at Bougainville, Marine TBF Avengers dropped time-delayed bombs only 75 yards in front of their own troops. At Peleliu, Corsairs dropped napalm into limestone caves at Bloody Nose Ridge, just 15 seconds from the airfield. The Marines' use of close air support was a principle Navy and Army aviators found hard to accept. The war's definitive example of close air support was performed by the Marine Corps, ironically, not for their own troops, but for the Army in the Philippines. The instruments would be specialized communications and an aging workhorse of the Pacific. The SBD had first seen action at Midway. By 1945, it had gone out of frontline service with both the Navy and Army Air Corps. Only the Marines retained the venerable Dauntless. In the Philippines, it was the right weapon for the job.
It was very accurate in a dive. With those split flaps, it could drop on something as small as this building and hit just this building. Of course, you had to have a lot of practice to do that, but we had the practice. A typical dive, you'd come in at about 20,000 feet, but we were sometimes at 18, sometimes only at 15,000 feet. And to slow the plane down, we'd find a target here, we'd pull the plane to nose up like this, split the flaps, and come down like this, in a split S. And then we'd get onto the target. It was controllable and maneuverable all the way down in a dive, in a 70-degree dive, or even more than a 70-degree dive. Remember, the airplane's wings develop lift. And if you're flying along level, the lift pulls you up and gravity pulls you down so you can keep the airplane level. But when you're in a 70-degree dive, your plane is pointed straight down, hopefully at the target, but your wings now don't have gravity to work against, and they will pull you forward. So in order to go straight down, you have to go more than a 70-degree dive, more than straight down, in order to get onto the target. We typically would not pull out above 1,500 feet. Those of us who got hits anyway. And some of us cheated and went down to about 1,000 feet. But then we paid for it because we'd be shrapnel in the tail end of our airplane. Mechanics frowned on that.
Marine SBDs would provide essential top cover for the Army's advance to Manila.
It was just made to order for close air support work as we developed it. And the object was not just to capture the capital, but to release the prisoners of war, the people who had survived Corregidor and Bataan. And MacArthur's theory was if they could get down there fast enough, they might save their lives. So the cavalry was moving as fast as they could on trucks and in jeeps. And when they got to a roadblock, they would dismount, call for air support if they could get it, and we would blast the path in front of them. And then they would get in their trucks and they'd go down about as fast as those jeeps would work. Imagine the poor artillery. They would get in place ready to support this column, continually displacing and moving one gun or one battery forward. And it was a nightmare for them. But it was made to order for close air support because we became their artillery, in fact.
Determined to get the most out of every bomb, the Marines reorganized their ground-air radio teams.
They were running into trouble describing the targets. When you look at the target on the ground, the ALO would say, do you see that third building on the left with the red roof? And we're coming in at 20,000 feet, all color is gray, and we don't know which way this guy is facing or where his starting position is. We had difficulty understanding what he was talking about. But that happened enough times that they figured communications would be better if an aviator was talking to aviators.
As an air liaison officer, Roger Champa would experience firsthand the impact of effective air support.
The key to the operation was a assault on a position called Mount Daho. It was an extinct volcano, all covered with rainforest. The Japanese had made a fine defense of that with caves and tunnels. The biggest weapon they had was 75 millimeter. Most of them were 40 and 20 millimeter guns. A lot of mortars, a lot of machine guns. The battalion had a inkling of where some of these targets were. I got into a position where I could see from a foxhole where some of them were, and we conducted airstrikes against those. Then the battalion took off with 2 companies in the assault, and that was a mistake. They were pinned down after moving just a few feet. The only thing that saved them was the artillery officer was there in the hole with us, and he had artillery time fire airbursts that put the Japanese back in their tunnels and their holes. And all night long, the medics were taking the 32 casualties I think we had in just a few minutes. But one thing that had done was it opened up to me by gun flashes all of these different positions. So I took my aerial photo map and marked these gun positions on it, and I was all set to hit them the next day. I was prepared. I had 9 SBDs on the hour, every hour from sunrise to sunset, hitting these known targets. In the late afternoon, just before sunset, we had the Corsairs come over and fire their .50 calibers. While they were doing that, the troops got up and assaulted the position. They took it without firing a shot.
Amidst the devastation and carnage of the Japanese emplacements, Lieutenant Champa, the aviator, would come to know the timeless, brutal reality of the infantryman.
And I went up there on that hill, and I was counting the bodies, and I said, that's mine. And the artillery officer said, no, that's mine. That piece of shrapnel hit him. And I said, no, the bomb hit that. See the way the brains are spread out? And can you imagine sitting on a field arguing about these things? Well, while I was counting these bodies, infantryman, an old infantryman, I must have been 40 years old, came up to me. He was skinny as a rail. He had yellow eyes from taking too much Ativan. And he grabbed me by the shoulder and he said, son, sit down. He said, I've been in combat for 44 months, and I've been carrying this can of peaches with me, waiting for something good to celebrate. He said, this is it. I thought I was going to get killed today. I saw what happened in the last assault. He said, we took this without firing a shot. I want you to sit down and share this can of peaches with me. So sat down and all that mess, we ate a can of Del Monte peaches. That's when I figured, you know, if we can win one battle with close air support, where the infantry doesn't have to bleed, maybe someday we'll be able to win a whole war that way.
So impressive was the ground-air coordination in Luzon and Mindanao, the 6th Army commander singled out the Marine Air Groups for commendation. The Philippines campaign would provide valuable lessons in the development of the Marine Air Ground Team, lessons that would pay big dividends in the years to come. Marines pioneered the use of the largely untested helicopter, redefining the tactics of amphibious assault. The new concept of vertical envelopment uses these troop-carrying helicopters to bypass enemy strongpoints and provide a way to get more Marines to more places than was ever possible. June 25, 1950, the North Koreans strike across the 38th parallel. American air and ground forces are committed to the fight. It would be a war marked by technical progress and political impasse. In Korea, Marine Corps aviation relied on a combination of old and new technology. The use of helicopters by Marines to deploy ground forces introduced new concepts to air warfare and revolutionized combat medicine. Ground-air coordination techniques were refined. Marine close air support was critical to the 1st Marine Division's breakout from the Chosin Reservoir. No less than 6 types of jet aircraft were introduced in the skies over Korea. For the Marines, this technical innovation had mixed results.
The F-9, F-2s did their best in Korea. They didn't have the time on station. They couldn't loiter. They had to get the ordnance off and get back. Their accuracy was all right. They didn't have the load capacity. But, you know, the Marine Corps had them, and we had a war going, so let's use them. And we learned a lot. And it was very important that those two F-9F squadrons were in the war in Korea. A great deal of what we learned there rolled on into the years ahead. And you remember those lessons.
For most UN troops, close air support meant one thing: the whine of a Corsair coming in low.
The Army really loved to have those bent wing Corsairs check in for airstrikes. It was our specialty. Not that the Air Force guys couldn't do it. They just didn't seem that interested in doing work that close, that important to the ground maneuver. If we were working in front of the Army, we gave it just as much as we did for Marines, and they really saw, I think, many of them for the first time, how effective close support could be if it was properly directed, if it wasn't wasted, and if it was really targeted and directed precisely.
Primitive yet brutally efficient, napalm became the weapon of choice for close-in support.
It's jellied gasoline and a spare fuel tank, and you hang that where you would have hung your 2,000-pound bomb on the Corsair. You make your evasive movement on the approach to the target, and you come in just 20 feet over the ground.
Scrape it off. I mean, you just eyeball it and release where you know it can't miss. This sounds very grisly, but let's face it, when people are shooting at your friends, you go try to kill them. And so you try to run it down trench lines and into positions and things like that, and it shuts them down fast.
As the fighting wore on, Marines and the Air Force clashed over air tactics. The Air Force de-emphasized close support, promoting instead a policy called interdiction.
The plan is ingenious. Cut the bridges, cut tracks, close tunnels, hit rail marshalling yards, make life miserable for the communists, interdict, strangle, night and day.
Those targets were hot, and we got suckered into a lot of flak traps. The interdiction campaign was just on day after day after day, and that's where we took most of our lumps.
We lost 20% of our squadron pilots. By this time, the North Koreans had not only MiGs, but they had radar-controlled guns, and the anti-aircraft was already picking us off right above the clouds.
Moving targets were very scarce, hard to find. They wouldn't move in the daytime if there was any air overhead. The 5th Air Force had control over all of the air assets. They were scratching for places to run this air power against that they thought would make a difference.
Through concealment and night movements, the communists kept supplies moving south up until the armistice in 1953. The losses sustained in the attacks on North Korea would have major influence on the future of Marine Corps aviation. The Marines' commitment to the ground support role would be realized in a new generation of aircraft in a new war in Asia.
Everyone wanted to go supersonic. This was the big thing, supersonic. Well, I went through the industry and they said it would be almost impossible to build a supersonic attack airplane at the technology we have now and the engines we have and all. And the second place, we wouldn't know how to drop bombs out of it anyway. We finally convinced the supersonic boys that we couldn't build a supersonic attack airplane. We've put all of our specs into an all-weather attack airplane and eventually turned out to be the A6.
The all-weather Grumman Intruder carries twice the load of a World War II B-17 at treetop level, if necessary. Used extensively in Vietnam, later models of the A-6 continue to serve the Marines with distinction. What many consider to be the premier example of the multi-role fighter began its career with more limited objectives.
It was a pure fighter, being developed by the Navy as a pure fighter. And I said we couldn't use that in the Marine Corps because our airplanes have to be able to carry bombs as well as being a fighter airplane. The F-4 has very seldom ever been used as a pure fighter. It's always been used as an attack airplane.
The McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom entered the Vietnam War in 1965. It was the most powerful fighter in the world.
The F-4, I love the machine. I mean, it's a manly fighter. It was a good fighter, but of course we primarily used it over there in a air-to-ground role. You had no qualms about putting a string of napalm 40, 50 feet away from friendlies, because you knew that you trusted your ability and also the accuracy of the airplane enough to go do this.
To provide on-call close air support, the Marines developed the Short Airfield for Tactical Support, SATS, a descendant of the forward-based airstrips of World War II.
This was at Chu Lai, 52 nautical south of Da Nang, the main base. We had resting gear on either end, so unless wind was a serious factor, you would just trap in whichever end your squadron was parked. I had 4 A4 squadrons, 20 plane squadrons. Just a ton of firepower. We really could break things and hurt people with what we had there.
The small but rugged A4 was an exercise in design simplicity.
The A4 was pretty much the designated close support machine. It was the right bird at the right place. Lives in the field very well, lives in the dust and the dirt and the rain. You could bend that little bird around in valleys that the F-4 couldn't do.
The air-ground team performed effectively in the face of enormous logistical and environmental challenges. The key was flexibility.
You didn't have a stabilized front of any kind. There are all kinds of variations on how it worked. Quai Son, of course, was a special situation where you had this outpost beleaguered, and they just brought the stuff right in almost on top of themselves.
The successes of the ground support effort did not extend to the interdiction campaign, which summoned painful memories of the Korean experience.
Back then, we had some very stupid targets. Some of the lessons learned, of course, we were later on able to apply during Desert Storm, or some of us that had served in Vietnam and saw some of the stupidity that went on over there would then be able to say, hey, we're in leadership positions now, we're not going to let this happen again.
The charred and gutted remains of the Iraqi war machine bear mute witness to a new age in military technology. The invasion of Kuwait on August 2nd, 1990, set into motion a chain of events that would culminate in the most intense air campaign in history. It was followed by a blitzkrieg land assault on Iraqi positions. The Gulf War would provide a stunning example of Marine Corps global mobility and the firepower of the Air-Ground Task Force.
Within 2 days, all our equipment arrived. We were the first force there that had some capability, but also had some sustainability. We had 15,000 Marines that basically were ready to fight. And we were able to provide a stopgap measure till, in fact, heavier forces could be brought into theater. And our role, of course, when we initially got there was strictly of a defensive nature. Within 24 hours after we arrived, we had an airborne combat air patrol in the northern Gulf.
The extended buildup of forces during Operation Desert Shield allowed the Marines to develop effective air tactics.
In the interim between Vietnam and Southwest Asia campaign, There was a lot of emphasis on low-level ingress. The European scenario, you go in low, you pop up, try to acquire the target. I knew that in the heat of battle, the battlefield, smoke, all kinds of other distractions, people shooting at you, these kind of tactics were not going to work. There's another thing, too, that needs to be considered. During the warm-up phase, we went out in the desert and had some of our airplanes make runs on me. When you come in at low level, even 100, 200 feet, you can see an airplane in the desert. You've got this haze layer. You can see even a gray-painted airplane. You can see at 5-6 miles. And what we found out is it doesn't even matter what the sun angle is. If you come in at high altitude with about a 45-degree dive, it is nearly impossible, nose on, to see an F-18. And you're never going to go see the airplane until, in fact, he's pulling out. So this, again, dictated our tactics.
As the world watched, the coalition of forces arrayed against Saddam Hussein struck with deadly precision.
Well, at midnight of the day that Desert Storm started, we said, Navy, you got the cap, we're out, we're going to go kill Iraqis.
Marine Corps EA-6 Prowlers and FA-18 Hornets supported the initial coalition airstrikes into Iraq.
01, 05.
Our job is to make sure that any missile systems or radar systems that can see our fighters, our bombers that are going in, our job is to jam them, make sure that they don't get locked up by missiles or shot down by AAA, that it could be radar guided.
After about day 3, it became very evident that in fact we had defeated their radars and their integrated air defense system.
As the ground offensive approached, the Marines redirected their attention.
As Marines, of course, we were very anxious to start working southern and central Kuwait, because that's the area where our ground troops eventually were going to fight.
The Russian-made anti-aircraft artillery was a formidable threat, particularly the ZSU-23-4 Shilka.
We considered the ZSU-23-4 to probably be the most capable AAA piece that they had, and that was primarily a low-altitude AAA piece.
In order to be able to provide the close air support, we made a concerted effort to take down the AAA defenses.
By using their high-altitude tactics, the Marines were able to avoid or beat down the AAA.
It's just we had intimidated them to the point where they knew that if they had the audacity to go shoot at a great twin-tailed airplane, somebody would rain hell, death, and destruction on them. So it worked.
On February 24th, coalition troops launched ground attacks into Kuwait and southern Iraq. Armored forces crossed the Saudi frontier and penetrated the Iraqi defense line. In 100 hours, it would be over. Even the coalition was stunned by the swiftness of the Iraqi collapse. Marine Air's unique combination of fixed and rotary wing aircraft was able to support the ground element in any situation. Once again, the key was flexibility.
This was more or less a motorized, mechanized campaign with fixed wing taking care of the enemy threat a couple of miles forward of the friendly line of troops and going all the way to 20 miles or so, 20, 25 miles, and the helicopters providing the real close-in support.
The vertical takeoff and landing AV-8 Harrier operated from forward locations inside Kuwait and for the first time from an assault ship.
The Harrier's unique capability is obviously its basing. And unless you have a big deck aircraft carrier in the neighborhood that can provide all of the carrier aircraft, having a Harrier that can fly off an LHA is something that the ground combat element is really, really happy to see.
The veteran A-6 Intruder flew every night and many days of the war.
If you had a precision target, you would go send the A-6s in at night and they would use precision-guided munitions, and they did wonderful work.
The FA-18 Hornet proved to be the Marines' workhorse. It can carry a wide assortment of weapons for use in fighter, bomber, or close support roles. The Hornet's sting is matched only by the newest addition to marine aviation's arsenal, the all-weather 𝑓A-18D. This new version of the Hornet uses avionics and sensors, as well as a second pair of eyes, to accomplish a variety of ground support missions.
The backseater would be there with he'd be there 10, 12, 15,000 feet with a high-powered set of binoculars. He'd look at the target, and he was then able to tell, is this a fake target? Is it a real target? Is anything down there? Using the two-seat F-18, we were able to go put bombs on targets instead of putting bombs in the sand.
6 squadrons of the D model will carry Marine Corps aviation into the 21st century. The newest of these squadrons are the Vikings from El Toro, California.
It is really a super platform that conduct not only close air support, but the whole vast array of Marine Corps fixed-wing tactical aviation missions. From air-to-air, air-to-ground, and night attack. When you take a look at all that, the F-18D is quite an awesome airplane. It has a weapons systems operator in the back seat that can handle those weapons, those sensors, those missions that require a 2-person crew. We really see the advantage of this in night attack, where both air crew are on night vision goggles and utilizing the sensors of the aircraft.
My experience with the goggles has taught me that it takes a while to get used to them, maybe 20 or 30 hours behind the goggles before you really feel comfortable. You still can pick up good-sized targets at long distances, and it really helps out when you're trying to acquire the target.
The F-18D, I think, has a super future ahead of it for Marine Corps fixed-wing aviation, especially in a close air support role, the air-to-ground role. The Marine Corps pilot or the air crewman that is on board that aircraft conducting that mission for the Marine Corps ground team, or the grunts on the ground, does a very good job because he understands what the grunts are all about. Our primary mission is support that Marine grunt on the ground, that rifleman, and when he needs devastating air power from the sky, we'll be there to provide it in any shape, manner, or form.
Allied forces may not always have the luxury of an extended buildup as they enjoyed in Operation Desert Shield, nor can commanders assume that future regional wars will be short or that they will be fought in areas with ample roads, ports, or airfields. The technology and techniques will continue to evolve, but 80 years of struggle and innovation have validated the fundamental concepts of the Marine Air Ground Task Force and produced a fighting force unique to aviation and modern warfare.